spring is in the air. There are a few problems in this system here. As I said, it is a system which is meant to kind of deal with all kind of problems which may arise. It does so to some extent, at least in a good manner, but there are some problems which maybe it doesn't solve quite adequately. But of course, it has to be also these, you might say, these underlining non-binding regulations and laws, they need to cover everything, you might say. So, of course, also, as we said, the period of acceptance is very important because that is the limit as to how long the offerer will be bound. And make no mistake, once you have put an offer out there in the market and it is binding on you, you do not necessarily sleep very well at night. Of course, you ought to, but given that this should bring value to both parties, certainly. But of course, things may change. Once you send the offer, maybe the price changes, goes up and down, and now it's not an attractive offer or a contract for the offerer or vice versa. So once you have the offer out there, things may change, rendering the offer something, you may regret it soon enough, but you're still bound. So that's the whole thing here. So it's very important to understand that the period of acceptance shouldn't be longer than it need be. Of course, if he decides himself, then he has himself put his head in the noose, you might say. But what happens, as I said, the regulation here has to take account of all eventualities. So maybe the offer, he has neglected to put a period of acceptance in the offer. Maybe he didn't say anything about that in the offer. Now, does that mean that it is not an offer? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that he is bound until eternity? No, of course not. We have a seemingly ample solution here in Section 3, which we call the legal period of acceptance. That is the period as specified in the Act. You might say it's the same as Section 2. Only in Section 2 the period is specified by the offer. Down here it is for some reason not. Maybe he didn't want to, maybe he's just forgot it. That is beside the point, really. The main thing here is that if he has not put in a period of acceptance in the offer, then this will apply. So you need to be able to calculate what will then, in such a case, be the period of acceptance. And I'll try. This is one of the most difficult sections here in this part of the Act, certainly. So pay attention here, because it says here that if the offer is made by letter or telegram, and of course the same thing goes if it is made by email or, I don't know, maybe carrier pigeon would be a problem, but it's only because it's an old Act. You shouldn't pay too much attention to this telegram thing. So it's made by letter or telegram or email, and no period for acceptance has been fixed. Well, we have a few latecomers here. Please be aware of the camera here. Yeah. You can come in. We'll cut it out later, of course. We'll have to do some editing here on your behalf. Yeah. Better late than never. I think I'll leave it on for just to shame them or whatever. Now, pay attention here to Section 3, the legal period of acceptance. The period of acceptance as decided according to the law. It says here that, as it says, if no period for acceptance has been fixed, the acceptance must reach the offerer within the period as could be anticipated by him, the offerer, to pass when making the offer. Now, what does that mean? It means that once the offer, let's take out the revocation here. It's only confusing us at this point. It's not been revoked. It is still up and running. So in this case, what happens is that at this point in time, the offer comes to the notice of the offeree. There is, in this offer, there is no fixed period for acceptance. Now, in this case, as it says here, the offeree must put himself in the shoes of the offerer at this point in time to consider what he thought, what he could have anticipated to pass when making the offer, the period he could have anticipated. That doesn't give us much guidance, but there is more, fortunately. But that's actually the requirement here for the offeree having received the offer, is that he has to consider what did the offerer consider when making the offer here, maybe several days before. Of course, it's a difficult task. There are some guidelines here in the next sentence when we are told here that in calculating this period, unless otherwise indicated, it shall be presumed that the offer is received in due time. Now, this is the first consideration. It is presumed. And this is a calculation, so regardless of when the offer was actually received, we will, in the calculation, assume that it was received in ample time, in due time. Because, and this is relative to the mode of transport or the media of delivering this information. In other words, this is a normal letter. We might say 1 day. If it is a B letter, maybe 2 or 3 days. If it's an email, just a few minutes. So if you receive the offer by letter and you receive, let's say you receive it over here. It's been delayed by the postal service. This has no effect on the calculation of the period of acceptance. That will remain the same regardless of this delay, because we assume that it was received in due time, which is here. And this, of course, follows logically, because it is what the offerer would have known at this point in time. And of course, at this point in time, he didn't know that it would be delayed. So in calculating this, we might say we have a forwarding time, FT, we call it here, forwarding time. That's one element. There are 3 elements in this calculation. So it shall be presumed that it is received in due time and that the acceptance is sent. The acceptance is the answer, is sent without delay after the person to whom it is addressed has had a reasonable time to consider it. So now follows here a reasonable time to consider until here. Reasonable time to consider. And this, of course, is elastic span, by the meter. So this is where it becomes difficult. What is a reasonable time for him to consider? We will revert to that in a moment. But what it says is that once he has had this reasonable time to consider, then he has to return the answer, the acceptance, without undue delay. And this, of course, is in the interest of the offerer, that he is not to be bound longer than need be. So he has to grant the offeree a reasonable time to consider, but no more. So as soon as this period has expired, in our calculation, we will have to calculate this period, and then he has to send it back as soon as possible after this. And what it says here, that it is sent without delay after he has had this time to consider, and that it is not delayed in transmission going back. So we have a return time, RT, forwarding time, return time, and reasonable time to consider. These are the 3 elements of the legal period of acceptance. And then we have one more small help here, because it says here in the final sentence here of section 3, it says here that if the offer is made by telegram, the acceptance shall be communicated by telegram unless it can reach the offer in due time by another method equally fast. Now, what does that mean? Or what does it indicate to us? Well, it indicates that the return time cannot be longer than the forwarding time in our calculation. So if this is 1 day, then this has to be 1 day as well. Can be half a day, or you may answer by email, it's 2 minutes, but it can't be 3 days. It can't be longer than the forwarding time. That's what is indicated by the last sentence here. It talks about a telegram, but we should understand this as an expression of a principle. So in calculating the time here, we have the forwarding time, and let's say this is done by an ordinary letter. So that is 1 day, and then we have the return time, and we will then calculate that also 1 day here in our assumed calculation. Now, please remember that this calculation has nothing to do with what actually happens. It may be, delayed and only received at this point in time weeks later, even after the period has expired. That is of no consequence to the calculation itself. So I'll just take that out again to not confuse it more than need be. We are back with a reasonable time to consider. So it means actually that making the offer at this point in time, the offerer must grant the offeree a reasonable time to consider the offer. He must have taken that into consideration when calculated what would be what he anticipated here to pass. He must have anticipated that the other party should have a reasonable time to consider. So what elements do we bring into play, making up our minds as to what may constitute a reasonable time to consider? Let's take an example. The one guy is offering the other guy some fresh lettuce. Now it's not by mail, forget about the mail. He receives an email in the morning, fresh lettuce, price and whatnot, may be delivered anytime you like. How long time does he have to answer? 5 minutes. Why? Why does it have to be fast?
I'll probably say service.
Yeah? Because it's food and it's lettuce. The idea about mentioning lettuce is that it is something which will, it will rot or corrupt quite fast. So a week later, the lettuce will be lost. So of course, what it is, it may be something which may have a short lifespan. It may be a seasonable product. It may be something which is in fashion or out of fashion or something like that. And from these circumstances, you may be able to make some considerations as to what is reasonable in this time. Does it call for a longer or for a shorter period of acceptance in this regard? It may be something where the price fluctuates. If the price goes up without warning, let's say he receives here a phone call from the other or an email from the other guy saying, you want to buy, I have a shipload of crude oil somewhere in the Indian Ocean, 250,000 tons. You may buy. How long time does he have to consider?
Longer.
You may think so, but as you know, the commodity markets is going up and down all the time. The oil price is being traded every second. So if you're given an offer with a fixed price, then of course it's almost in the spur of the moment. You have to almost accept immediately. So it comes down to what is reasonable. Of course, the situation of the offeree is also taken into account. If this is an important thing for him, if the offer is something complicated, he's offered to buy a jack-up rig, which is to be built somewhere in Korea or wherever, the value of $3 billion or something like that. Well, of course, you'll have to have a bit more time to consider whether the offer is attractive. He may have to call in consultants and whatnot to consider and help him make up his mind. This calls for a longer time for him to consider. So, in short, everything may come into play. We have to use the terrible thing called common sense here as to taking into the balance what is the market, what is the product, what is the situation of the offerer versus the offeree, and so on and so forth. Everything we can think of which will tell us, should this be shorter or longer, we will, in our answer at the exam or wherever, we will say, well, this speaks for longer, this calls for shorter, and then we'll make up our mind, and we'll say, reasonable time to consider, it is 8 days. This is our this is our conclusion, and we'll put this together, and we'll end up here. In this case, uniquely with 10 days is the period of acceptance. Of course, as you can probably easily imagine, here's the legal period here in Section 3 is a very difficult entity, and but the main thing is that you make the relevant considerations, come up with some kind of answer, and use it in the intended manner here when that's relevant.